All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Ratha, and this is my co-host, Bruce Merkin, and we are going to be, this is going to be our first episode for our communications podcast. We're really excited. I think we have a lot of plans in terms of just being able to share out with folks and people in our community and in the field of nonprofit and social justice, just different ways of how to utilize communication and also just reacting to what's happening in our current world and what are the communications aspects of that. And today's topic is going to be on the recent debate that happened, what, Tuesday? Was it Tuesday, September 10th? Bruce? Yeah. So I'm gonna introduce Bruce and let Bruce talk a little bit about himself, a little bit, and then a little bit about myself, and then we'll get into just discussing this debate that just happened. Yeah, go for it, Bruce.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Bruce Merkin, and greetings from Hilo, Hawaii, where today it's not nearly as sunny as the background picture behind me would have you believe. Um, but I am a longtime participant in the communications wars, starting as a freelance journalist back in the late 80s and 90s. I hopped the fence to the other side in 2001 when I became communications director at the Marijuana Policy Project, advocating for legalizing cannabis back before that was a fashionable cause, which was an interesting experience on many levels. After 8 years there, I moved over to the Greenlining Institute, where I had several different titles over the year, but I basically handled media relations and also was kind of resident writer and editor. Um, and I was there for about a dozen years. And a couple of years ago, I decided it was time to slow down and I moved to Hawaii and I am just doing some consulting and contract work now and hanging out with cool people like Ratha.
Yeah, Bruce. Also, greenlining is where we met. And yeah,
Yeah,
so
1,000 years ago.
yeah, a long time. And yeah, thanks, Bruce. That's a great intro. And then yeah, well, a little bit about myself and just my communications background. I started off as really in creative writing well before I did any social justice work, and then got really politicized in community college, went to UC Berkeley, studied under George Lakoff, and really learned about frames and metaphors and cognitive linguistics, and then really tried to put that into practice throughout years of working in the nonprofit world on different campaigns and stuff like that. And we'll be sharing a lot of those insights about where that applied throughout these episodes coming up. But first, let's for our topic of today, let's talk about that debate. I think that if we want to call it a debate, Bruce, I don't. I feel like we can't
You
even
know,
call it a debate.
it was so boring and routine. I'm not sure there's anything to talk about, really. You know, it's just a snooze fest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and while everybody else is talking about who won the debate, which, I think is just um not even our uh, not what we're going to be talking about. I think what we want to talk about is like why did the candidates say what they said? What is their strategy behind it? But yeah, Bruce, what are some of your takeaways to start off?
So I think we can kind of divide this into a couple of different categories. Looking at it for the beginning, from Kamala Harris's point of view, as the candidate, um, probably less known to most voters, particularly undecided and low information voters. Um, she had to introduce herself and lay out what her vision is, what a Harris administration might look like. And so she had that was kind of the normal set of circumstances that any candidate, or even not a candidate, but an issue advocate in a debate on talk radio or whatever would have to do, lay out their case. Um, and of course, she also had the special circumstance of dealing with an opponent who is, shall we say, unique. Uh, the inevitable waterfall of lies, and the volatile personality of the former president. So you can sort of divide those into those two categories. Clearly, she set out right from the beginning uh, to lay out who she was and what her vision was, and establish her individual personality, make a little bit of distinction between her and President Biden. And of course, it's always difficult when you're running as vice president because you can't disown the prior administration. You can't seem to be snarking at the person who gave you the job. At the same time, you have to establish who you are. Um, and she started off in that vein. But then she also clearly was very well prepared uh, to deal with Mr. Trump, and we can get into that in a minute. But that was she had two jobs, and I think she clearly had put some thought into both of them.
Yeah, I I agree, and I feel like what we want to try to do is like uncover from their messages what was their strategy. Like right before the debate in those communications meeting, what was Harris's camp strategy, what was Trump's strategy. And I think even going back into one of the famous debates between Kennedy and Nixon, in which they did a poll after that debate and about who won, right? And that has been a big influence in terms of presidential debates being a platform for who's going to appear to be the stronger candidate, and how just being the stronger candidate um, plays into what voters have confidence in being able to vote in. And that's not necessarily taking into account like actual data, honesty, or facts or things like that. So it's a very interesting, field that this platform already has. And I think Harris was able to do that in terms of just like how Trump has changed the debate is that Trump really attacks the other candidates so he can appear stronger and tries to bully people. And so it's really went from not just answering the questions, it wasn't enough for Harris to just answer all the questions. It needed to include being able to show that she was a better candidate than Trump. And so, yeah, I agree that, and also just introducing a little bit of herself to the president, because even though she was the vice president for the last 3 years, you know, she doesn't really get that much airtime, and really needing able to introduce herself. So it's, she started doing that, introducing her stories and about her childhood and stuff like that too. So yeah.
Yeah, you you brought up the Kennedy Nixon debates, and one of the interesting things, and it's been a while since I've read this, so I'm fuzzy on some of the fine points, but at least some of the polling made a distinction between folks who had just heard the debate on radio versus people who watched on TV. The
Yep.
people who heard it on radio tended to more think more that Nixon had won. The
Yep.
people who watched it on TV absolutely thought Kennedy had won. And visuals matter, how you come across, how you look, and that's something that people who delve who spend their time with ideas and thoughts and policies forget about that. Going back to Kamala Harris, she clearly did. The first thing that I always tell people when I'm helping people prep for any sort of media encounter, whether it's an interview or a debate or whatever, is do your homework. Go in there knowing what you want to say, knowing how you want to say it, anticipating the questions that you might be asked, especially the ones you don't want to be asked, and
Yes.
being ready. And she had clearly done that. And that's the first lesson for anybody. And, to contrast poor Joe Biden and his debate uh, appearance in June, and I am not qualified to say what happened, to what degree it might be some cognitive decline or lack of preparation or bad preparation or whatever. I don't know. But he came in not seeming like he had an agenda, not seeming like he had a strategy. He had some factual points that he kept kind of groping for, but he never had a coherent story. And that's the key to all this. What is the story you're telling? And Kamala Harris clearly had a story. It's, I care about you, not rich people. I unlike my opponent who just cares about himself, uh, I want a forward-looking vision. I want to help the middle class. I want to create an opportunity economy. And I think she managed to pretty skillfully contrast that with Trump, who didn't really have any sort of vision except be scared of dark-skinned immigrants.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, and I do feel like Kamala could have done more in the story department. I think she nailed it in terms of the framing, and when in communications, it's a good practice to know your frames, but to be able to tell the stories that elucidate those frames without having to explicitly say it. And there is a point in the debate where she says, I want to have a hope opportunity and the hope agenda or an economy of opportunity. And so she explicitly says it, but it would have been good. She really could have nailed it if she could have landed it with stories, like successful stories that she's had in her vice presidency, and being able to say, "Hey, look, this is a moment when we support people." Like for example, when the what's it called, the COVID stimulus bill, and then people use some of the stimulus bill to create businesses. I think that's a great story that she could have really brought in terms of how she's looking at her 50,000 to start new small businesses is looking to help America. I think that could have been a great opportunity for that. But she hit on all the frames, and yeah, and then Bruce, you got anything to build off that, and then see what.
Yeah, I will say it's very easy for us after the fact, not in the heat of the moment with TV cameras on you and tens of millions of people watching, to second guess. And I do think there were a number of things that, looking back, she could have done a little more of or a little better. Um, you nailed one of them. There's certainly stories not just from her vice presidency, but her days as a senator and California Attorney General.
Yep.
Um, and I also think that there were. I actually I have to say for the first 15 minutes of the debate, I thought it was about a tie. She
Yeah.
started off kind of slow, um, and I thought, as long as we're nitpicking for a moment, I thought her answer to the first question was not as strong as it could have been. The first question for folks who don't remember was about the economy, and David Muir, one of the moderators, asked, "Can you tell people that they're better off now than they were 4 years ago?" And instead of answering that, she went right to her economic plan, which clearly she needed to get to.
Yep.
But it sounded like she was dodging the question.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I tell people is there are definitely times when there's a question you want to avoid and you don't want to answer, but it's always best to not be obvious that you're avoiding the question. And in this case, she didn't have to. She could have said, well, when we took office, the unemployment rate was about 6.5%. Today it's 4.2, and it's been in about the 4% range for the last 2.5 years. So we've made a lot of progress, but there's more to do, and here's what I want to do.
Yep.
But again, that's 2020 hindsight. I wasn't on stage under the TV lights.
Yes. I mean, come on. You're going for the presidency. You got to have that level of preparation. I feel like
Even presidential candidates are human, even though they don't want you to know that.
yes, I agree. I agree. But yeah, but hopefully if for next time, and for everybody else that's listening, have those bag of stories, like practice, rehearse, and on deck in terms of like knowing when to be able to deploy these stories to accentuate like any of the frames that you want to be able to talk to. And this is like in terms of just framing and metaphors, we'll look for another episode or look on it online. But I think I'd love to hear your thoughts because we got to talk about Trump as well. Like I think the framing battle was between fear and hope, and I think yeah, for all intents and purposes in terms of what Kamala was trying to bring about. And going into Trump, yeah, a lot of what Trump says is like, hey, fear this, and you have to fear this, and because this is such a big threat, and I'm using this because there's a lot of things that he said in terms of what to fear, in terms of fearing Kamala's record, her taking shots at her, which was like, oh, you can't trust her issue on race, and just taking all these personal attacks to try to discredit her as a person with less integrity, and then going into, just immigrants, the migrants at the border and the crisis, and then of course what everybody's been talking about is like getting your pets eaten as well. So, but yeah, what did you think about Trump? What do you think his that camp strategy was for that debate?
So I mean, to the degree that he had a strategy, and frankly, it felt like he had more. He had some tactics. I'm not sure he really had a strategy.
Yeah,
Um,
concept.
and this is a guy who, from at least what we read, doesn't really like to be coached and advised. Um, but as you said, he was really uh, digging in on the fear thing and claiming that the Biden Harris administration had been incompetent. Um, and so he's presenting himself as, the tough, all knowing, in charge uh, guy who's gonna fix things. Uh, because if you don't have me come in and fix things, these scary foreigners are going to come in and destroy your neighborhood. And on one sense, I understand why he does that because it got him elected in 2016. It has worked for him in the past. But I do think there's probably a ceiling on the number of people who can be moved by that. And my guess is that Harris is right, that there's some voters who may have once been susceptible to that who are getting a little tired of it. At a certain point, it does become essentially the same old song. And so I think Trump certainly shored up his base. There is, and I have to say this disturbs me no end, but there is 40% or so of voters who love that stuff and were probably applauding when he said they're eating the dogs. Um, but I think there's probably a cap to that. And I think Harris was right to go in the other direction and make that differentiation between fear and hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yes, when you said Trump was rallying his base, I that's when I was watching the debate, that's what I was thinking too. Because like if you think about who the target audience of the debate is, like you're looking at your base and undecided voters, and large percentage of the population are also independent voters as well. And so it was interesting to see like why, yeah, if there is a strategy, why he chose to go that way in terms of rallying his base, because that goes towards um just seeing who has the bigger base to turn out to in voting elections. And then the other thing I want to comment is like, why is he effective, or why was he effective even earlier? And part of communications is like, the more simple you can speak, the more effective that is. And so his simple manner of speech is effective just because it's easier to comprehend, and it's easier to stick into your mind. So for our brains, when we're listening to words, images and frames get triggered. And so no matter what, it's always it takes a minute to be able to stop critically think about things. But in our day-to-day world, that doesn't really happen very much often. And people who are paying attention don't really have you're being bombarded with so much stuff. Like these things are going to try to stick. And the other part is just the emotional tone and emotional hijacking of people's fears, of people's anger. So even though the economy may not be good, when people feel it, like with higher grocery prices and in terms of which that may or may not be concluded, that may or may not be connected with inflation versus, corporate greed and price control and collusion and stuff like that. That's where um, us as voters and us as community members have to be mindful of our emotions to make sure that we're not susceptible to this like emotional blackmail through this communication. Just because I can get triggered and riled up, really making sure that that is
Well,
checked.
and
Yeah.
the connect thread of demagogues and autocrats all through the centuries has been playing on people's fears, on people's emotions. And Trump is good at that. At least he has been in the past. I
Yep.
mean, this guy spent a dozen years or so as a reality TV host. Um, and that built his image. Uh, and you're absolutely right that unfortunately, and I say this as somebody who kind of likes to intellectualize things, uh, but when you're talking to a broad audience, you can't do that too much. You have to keep it simple, and you have to find things that emotionally resonate. And I think Harris's best moment on that was when the question of abortion came up,
Yeah.
and she talked about, Trump had done this nonsensical line about everybody wanted the issue sent back to the states, and Harris, you know, talked about an actual case of a woman, I think it was in Texas, who was told by the doctors that they couldn't treat her, that she had to go out into the parking lot and bleed until she was close to death, and then they could do it without fear of being arrested. And she said it much more grippingly than I just did. Um, and that is the sort of thing that gets people. And unfortunately, the things that people will probably most remember from that debate by the time election day rolls around is Harris's story of the woman bleeding out in a parking lot and they're eating the dogs, because those are the most vivid and emotional and memorable things that anybody said. Um, and I have to say, I find it kind of sad that our political dialogue in this country has reduced to that level. I mean, wouldn't it have been nice if the conversation on climate change, for example, had instead of been, is this real or not? But what exactly do we do about it?
Yep.
In a sane world, we'd have a Republican Party saying, okay, this is real. We think a market-based approach can work, or something like that. And you'd be arguing about how to do it rather than is the sky blue?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, this debate isn't what our country deserves in terms of our leadership,
I
and
have to say, forgive the interruption, but after the Biden Trump debate, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, who frankly sometimes annoys me, but he made an important observation I think a lot of people don't think about, which is that the skills involved in coming across well in a debate, the way these presidential debates are formatted, are really different than the skills involved being president of the United States. In a debate, you have to be quick on your feet. You have to have snappy comebacks. You have to have simple, vivid, emotional language. None of that applies when you're sitting in the Oval Office with your advisors trying to work out an economic plan or a healthcare plan or a climate plan or dealing with the military budget. Um, so we've created this sort of TV circus that highlights things that are not really relevant to the job. It's sort of like interviewing for a job as an accountant and being asked how many literature classes you took in school. Well, that's interesting, but it maybe is not going to help you crunch the numbers.
yep. Yeah. Yeah, and in our in our pre-discussion for this talk, like I was saying, like, yeah, this resembles much more like a rap battle than an actual debate. They're trying to drop really good lines and zingers to tear the other individual down. But as we were talking earlier, like Harris didn't quite answer a lot of her questions. She was trying to get to her talking points and her speech and stuff. But yeah, in a debate, they're talking about the different points and the nuances and the details that go above the surface level. And I don't think we ever got beyond the surface in the debate. And it's also a good example of listening to respond versus listening to understand. And think about how transformative that conversation would have been if those practices and principles were even applied there. Like it's probably hard to imagine now, but if
You're
both
talking about people trying to have a useful dialogue. That's not what happens in televised debates.
yeah. Oh, I know. One can dream. One can dream. One can dream. Um, but yeah, yeah, what else kind of stuck out for the base? So we have, their battle for the frames in terms of Kamala and Trump really trying their strategies to, be positioned as, one who can protect from threats and the other as one that will empower and uplift the community. And I think the other part is like they both take jabs at each other, but they're both it's not like those jabs are not like valid. Like I think there was a question about how we pulled out of Afghanistan and whether or not that was the right thing to do. And then I think what you said earlier was like you do need to take like find a way to take accountability, but then redirect it to your message. And you showed an example, really beautifully.
Yeah, and that's obviously something that politicians often struggle with. Trump is absolutely incapable of doing.
Yeah.
Certainly in the lead up to Afghanistan, his administration made some mistakes, and then I think there were clearly some failures of planning on the Biden side too. Um, but nobody in this sort of forum is willing to say, well, we all screwed up a little bit, and we should all learn from what turned out to be a pretty bad experience. Um, hey, I keep fantasizing that our leaders will behave like grown-ups, and maybe someday. I do think it's worth talking about one other thing, which is you always in this sort of adversarial situation, you do need to understand your opponent and what their talking points are and what they're likely to throw at you. And again, this is something that Harris had clearly put some thought into. Um, she was ready with the abortion story, for example, because she no doubt knew that he was going to say this nonsense about everybody wanted Roe overturned, everybody wanted the issue sent back to the states, which is crazy. It's a blatant lie. Um, but clearly, she had planned for that eventuality and was ready. And also, you know, she she just outpsyched him. She managed in many of her answers to leave these little time bombs, these little landmines, which he then went and stepped on every single one, um, because he can't resist responding when you say his rallies aren't the best in the history of humanity. Um, and, most of the time, you won't run into an opponent quite like Mr. Trump, which is probably good for everybody's sanity out there. Uh, but she clearly had war gamed what sort of an opponent she was up to, and and what would make him stumble. Um, and I do think if you're prepared to go into a confrontational situation like a debate, whether it's a formal debate like this or something on talk radio. I've done a lot of sort of issue advocacy debates where I was up against somebody on talk radio or TV from an opposing view, not a candidate, but a very similar sort of venue. And knowing what they may throw at you and knowing how they may try to psych you out and being ready for that is really important. I learned early on, back in my first communications job, my first TV appearance was back in 2002, beginning of 2002, in front of a mercifully small audience on a local public access cable show in Maryland, where the organization I was working for was trying to pass a medical marijuana bill. And I was debating an anti drug advocate named Joyce Nalepka, who immediately went for the emotional and clearly was trying to piss me off in a number of ways. And she basically tried to paint us as folks who were willing to sacrifice the lives of our children for our hedonistic desires. And at one point, she held up a trio of pictures of three young people, high school students, who had, she said, died of drug overdoses. And they all started with marijuana, she said. And I did absolutely the wrong thing. I got pissed off and I basically yelled at her. I said, you know that none of those kids died of a marijuana overdose because there's never been a documented marijuana. And what I said was true, but it came across absolutely wrong because I blew my cool. And looking at the video afterwards was kind of cringe. And happily, we were working with a coach at that point who was helping us um, improve our communications techniques. And I learned what I should have done, which was show some empathy first, respond to the facts eventually, but starting out saying, well, that's I feel for the parents of those kids. They went through something terrible. This is a tragedy, and we all want to prevent overdoses and tragedies like this from happening. But we do need to deal with the facts here, and you don't do any honor to these children's memory by distorting what happened. And that would have come across much more effectively. So I learned a lot of this stuff the hard way. But you do need to be prepared for that sort of stuff. Be prepared for the worst case scenario because it may happen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, with Trump is a very polarizing character, but there's a lot of grassroots candidates who are running for elections in a lot of different parts of the country. And I think what happens is like they're met with established politicians and Democrats, and they're going into candidate forums. And it's really important that the best thing that you can do is like to do your homework. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what it means to do your homework. Like if you're working
So
for the
say that again. I missed what it means to be what?
what it means to do your homework and
Ah,
prepare for, like, let's say, a debate. Like if we were advising one of these political candidates, what is the homework assignment that we want to give them?
all right. Well, I would start with something that you mentioned before, which is framing. What is your frame? Um, and one technique that I've learned to use, which I picked up from an outfit called the Opportunity Agenda. Um, Whether they borrowed it from somebody else, I don't know. But the framework is called VPSA, Values, Problem, Solution, Action. So you go from grounding your argument in things that people generally agree with, you know, ideas like freedom, opportunity, everybody should have a chance to develop their full potential. Take that to the problem, the issue, the thing you're trying to fix, the thing you're trying to change, and then from that to your proposed solution and the actions that can help get that solution to happen. So you have a logical progression from something that everybody can buy into to here's what's in the way and here's how we can fix it. Join me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would build off of that too, like one, just doing an audience map, like looking at who's your target audience, what do they care about, what do they value, and and then from there, once you figure out what they care about and what they value, you can really lead into that value, problem, solution, action message, you know. And so like an example would be, well, if the audience is voters who are concerned about the economy, so that means they're going to value those economic based conversations. And then you can then say, hey, look, we need a healthy economy. That's our value. um, what are the problems for it? You at least state out the problems, whether that's, you know, all those different possible problems, then the solution, and then the action. And then from there, I would also encourage to have those stories ready to accentuate every single part of those of the different part of value, problem, solution, and action. You can come up with a story for any of each of those areas. And then that's when you want to have enough of that equipped and ready, and then you know you can kind of get into those frame battles. And I want to see if I can pull up one of my training informations on framing and metaphor.
So while you're doing that, I'll just say that having those stories, you should have lots of stuff in your back pocket that you may not get to use, but you should have ready just in case. Stories that illustrate your points, story that illustrates the other side's shortcomings. A few facts. Do not bewilder people with 1,000 different facts and statistics. Pick one or two that really tell the story, the most dramatic and vivid ones. Part of the problem I think that Biden got into back in June was that he kept reaching for some fine details that just didn't really mean all that much and never told the story. Always remember, what is the story you're telling?
Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, I agree. I think Biden just wasn't ready to, you know, to me, I see these debates almost like fencing. You know, it's very close to like fencing. Like you have a minimal amount of movement. You have to be very precise and accurate. If you make mistakes, those mistakes are gonna go out. Also, your one of your earlier points I didn't get to build off on was like what people are gonna leave away from this debate. You know, here's the story on abortion, but also Trump and the pets. And you know what's important is like there's a great book called Made to Stick, which talks about sticky messages, and it's by Chip and Dan Heath. It's a really a marketing book, but it's really great just for overall communication. And in that book, there's a section on it where it talks about how a lie can spread faster than the truth. And that, and even though that, you know, people eating pets can be a lie, it still spreads faster than the truth. It's sticky and you know, it's very vivid, and people are that's what's going to stick to people. Whether or not that's the right content, I mean, that's a whole other conversation for that. But I think in general, you know, you do want to be able to create these sticky messages for people to stick on to people, you know. Yeah. Um, yeah, and then here I brought up some of the emotional frames. So there's all types of frames, you know, when people dive into the frames, but strong emotional frames, that's like hope and optimism, fear and urgency, empathy and compassion, pride and accomplishment, you know, outrage and injustice is one, excitement and anticipation. And then outside of emotional frames, there's also several other frames, just like, for example, sustainability and future generations, the us and them, a moral high ground, personal responsibility, equality of opportunity, nostalgia and tradition, accountability and transparency. So these are all different types of frames that are out there, and as you familiarize yourself with them, you'll see the debate through different lens. You know, you'll see them have this battle of frames that they're trying to win. But yeah, so let's recap for homework. So sounds like the audience map, putting together your core message, that you know follows that value, problem, solution, action, making sure you have a bank of stories, like a really good picture that you can pitch out. And then is there anything else that we're missing?
Um, well, I think we sort of covered this, but I'll say it again. Know the other side's talking points and have responses ready for them. And if you possibly can, try to find ways to turn their talking points around back at them. the sort of what I once heard referred to as rhetorical jujitsu. Um, and if I can reach back again to my days as a marijuana legalization advocate, a perfect example of that is one of the things that we kept coming up against was variations on what I mentioned before, the what about the children argument. Um, and so this is something that we just went out of our way to prepare for and have responses to. And some years after that initial story I told you, I was on a talk radio show in Santa Cruz, California. It wasn't a debate, but they took listener calls. And a man calls in and says, you know, when I was in college, I smoked pot, I did other drugs, I did lots of stuff. But then I got a little older and more mature. I became a Christian. I don't do any of that stuff anymore. And now I have a 13-year-old son, and I don't think marijuana should be legal because I don't want him to think it's okay. And because I was prepared, because we had thought about all this stuff, I was ready to answer him. But sir, I totally get that a lot of us, when we're young, do things that we look back on later when we're older and more mature and think, oh God, that was stupid. But I would ask you to think about whether your family would be better off today, whether your son would be better off today, if when you had done that stuff in college, if you had been arrested and put in prison and given a criminal record that'll follow you for the rest of your life, would your son be better off? And there was 3 or 4 seconds of silence. And then he said, I hadn't thought about that. And I don't think I convinced him necessarily right then or all the listeners, but I opened a window. I let a little light in. And sometimes you can do that, but you can't count on yourself to wing it. You can't improvise that stuff. You have to have these responses just in your back pocket and a little mental file card ready to pull out when you need to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah. And
And that's the hard part of doing your homework. Anticipating the stuff that you'd rather not deal with because it's a pain in the you know what.
yep. Yep. Absolutely. But hey, practice makes perfect, and well, I mean, progress over perfection for sure. And what's important is that you do your homework and you take the time to practice it, because when you're prepared, you get much better outcomes. And yeah, it's not just a presidential debate where this happens. It's all over the country in terms of where people, really try to speak up for different issue points and stuff. Doing a lot of work in environmental justice, one of the most common frame battles and debates that happen is like when you're in a public hearing, there's a policy, a bill, or an expansion project on deck, and then you have community members, environmentalists on one side, and then you have workers on the other side, and the workers are all talking about the economy and the jobs, and environmentalists are talking about the environment and health and safety. And then that becomes a real issue in terms of how do you reconcile that, which one is more valuable, so to speak. And that becomes something that the decision makers and the policymakers, really have to decide. But the more prepared you can be in terms of addressing, like what you said, the other side, uh the better off your position is going to be. And then so one of the things that I said, and then I'll let you go, is like, is really looking at the equity in the billions of dollars from the oil industry, and is that equitably shared with the workers who put their lives in danger every day to work at a refinery, and their health is that a consequence? Are they being fairly compensated? And if we can no longer refine or use oil, like, what is the fair compensation for them, so that way they don't have to come and keep advocating for jobs that also hurt their health as well. And so just being able to address that economy side, whether or not um decisions get made off of that, it's still, like what you said, kind of opens up that window.
Right. And that's a challenge. I think a lot of advocates, sort of get in their lane and they think of their frame, whether it's environmental justice or whatever. Um, but continuing with your example, you have to, if you're an environmental justice advocate, you need to be able to make those arguments because most of the time you're talking about relatively low income communities where people need jobs. They need to make a decent living, and often they're not doing it. So how can you frame that in terms of something that will speak to them and that will show that you understand their problem? So that you're not just sort of this callous environmentalist who wants to, preserve trees and not people. You have to sort of put yourself on the other side of the fence for a minute and look at it from that angle.
Yeah. And at some point it becomes less about winning the conversation, the argument, and more about collaborating and building community um to kind of keep going forward. Yeah.
Well, there you are being a damn radical again, Ratha.
Oh, whoops. Uh,
Actually, like be saying stuff. I don't think we can allow that.
yeah. I think it's a good place to leave it as well. Is like, yeah, the political debate and the conversation has been so divisive. And and for me as a community organizer, I work in a community, and the people are not as thinking about politics as when it's on television, as when it's on the topic. There's very few people where politics is their entire life, but it has such a big impact on everybody. And so it's always important for people to be mindful of it. But at the same time, it's also important that we don't let it create so much division that we're suddenly at odds with each other. Like, we can't lose the ability to have, productive conversations, to lose our compassion for each other, and to find a way to build community with each other. Because yes, even though 40% of our country, believes in voting for Trump, there's a reason why that is, and so why is it that what is going on in there? And it's not just because they're they're dumb or whatever. There's real reasons why people don't support the current government and the establishment. There's been harms. When Obama was in the administration, he had an initiative that closed down a lot of coal mines, and people who were working in coal mines suddenly lost their jobs. It created a lot of poverty. And so even though the intentions were good, the process and practices, there was still a lot of fallout there. And yeah, and all that contributes to the different sentiments that are happening today. And it's unfortunate that we can't have our leaders show accountability because they're too afraid that it would hurt their votes. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I do think you have to say also that the media bears some responsibility for stoking that sort of behavior. They focus so much on horse race coverage: who's up, who's down, who got an advantage, who landed a punch. Um, rather than pushing all the candidates on all sides from all ideologies to really talk about how we can work together, what the real problems are, how we can get to the solutions, and pushing people, frankly, to go beyond the sound bites that you and I would teach them.
Yep.
Would be a very healthy thing, but it happens so rarely. And I do, while we're on that subject, I just want to give a shout out to the ABC moderators, who I think did a really good job. They pushed candidates at times when they didn't really answer the question. Um, and I think they did the fact checking just at the right level. They didn't harp on every exaggeration or slight misstatement, but called out the big, huge, screaming lies. And I hope the folks at CNN were watching that and learning something.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, shout out to the moderators. That's always very difficult when you have individuals that don't respect decorum.
If I was moderating a debate with Trump, I'd want to wear a hazmat suit.
Yeah. All right, Bruce, is there any last thoughts? I think we covered it. I think we covered a lot of great things today, and just kind of just reviewing a little bit of
I
the
think
game.
at this point I'm talked out. I think I've run out of whatever wisdom I may have had to start with. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Thanks, Ratha.
Yeah, hey, this was awesome. Yeah, really appreciate you. And yeah, looking forward to future episodes. And so, if you're watching this in the future, they'll probably be listed. If you're gonna watch this relatively soon when this is being recorded, we're gonna have lots of stuff in terms of just communications and looking at different politics, looking at different case studies and stuff like that.
Yes, definitely watch for future episodes. This is just the beginning.
Yes, yes. All right, my name is Ratha. I'm signing off.
And Bruce and I am signing off too. See you all next time.